Welcome to Peace Week at the Carter School. I'm Daniel Rothbart, Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at the Carter School, and it is wonderful to have you join us for an event which we consider to be very important and I hope enlightening for everybody. This is the first day of Peace Week, as you know, organized by the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And as we've had Peace Weeks in the past, this Peace Week is intended to bring together faculty, students, and alumni, friend, partners, everybody who's interested in peace and conflict resolution, bring together for the purpose of having a what I hope is deep conversation, an open conversation, of course, to address issues of peace and conflict resolution. The theme of Peace Week is the integrating theory and practice in peace and conflict resolution. The event today showcases the work of a laboratory for peace called Transforming the Mind for Peace. And our event today is entitled Minds of Violence, Minds of Peace, Groundbreaking Discoveries for Peacebuilders. And the underlying theme here is to basically examine how people think, how conflict actors think, feel, and have even subliminal psychic processes in ways that both promote violence and also in potential ways in which they can actually promote peace. This theme is a combination of kind of a reality check and a moral vision. What I mean is that this theme basically draws upon some of the revolutionary discoveries in the social and psychological sciences that have been showcased in recent years. This reflects some of these discoveries at the forefront of the field in those sciences. And yet we are also motivated by a kind of moral vision, moral imagination, as Jean-Paul Lederach coins the term, to imagine what it would be like for conflict actors to draw upon their capacities to change both at the conscious level in terms of their emotional intensity associated with aggression, and even change at the subconscious level referring to some of the habituated thoughts and feelings and so-called understandings about themselves and their adversaries. So this is a moral vision for change. What we're going to hear today are the current state of 4 projects. The Peace Lab, is basically including or actively involved in actually 5, but today we'll talk about 4 projects which fit perfectly into applying this important blend of current science with a moral vision for positive change. And it's so exciting to work with the lab directors. And I just want to showcase something that really is a way to kick off what we are doing. And that is our, excuse me, I have a little delay here in our annual report. Oh, Toni, I would like to show this annual report. Can I share a screen?
Do you not have the option to share?
Yes. Okay, so here's our annual report, and that we recently put together. And this report, which we're going to disseminate very soon this week, basically showcases, and it shows the names and the various titles of our 29 members of our Peace Lab, and some of whom will be presenting today, of course. I can't go through all of them now. We have a great statement by Charles Cuellum, who's a doctoral student doing very important work already in the field. And we have summary statements about some of these projects. The first is activating curiosity. The Activating Curiosity project that is being carried out by Dr. Megan Price, Beltina Jaloshi, Shannon, Sneary, Alabanza. Another project is empathy and counter-empathy of conflict actors. The researchers are Toni Farris, Natalia Alexander, and Naomi Cranebring. Another project, important project, is Righteous Rage that I'm doing with a doctoral student, David Stebbins, and also a very important project, Empowering Psychological and Physical Health for Peacebuilders, that is being led by Nicholas Sherwood. And we are going to start right now with the Activating Curiosity Lab, and I'm so pleased to have Megan Price, Dr. Megan Price, lead this. And why don't you just say who you are? I'd like you to introduce yourself, if you don't mind, Megan.
Great. Thank you, Dan, of course. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Megan Price. I just want to thank you, Dan, for everything that you've done to pull this lab together and to lead the lab. I think it's an extraordinary project, and it's just really wonderful to be working with everybody. And thank you, everyone else, for joining today. My name is Dr. Megan Price. I'm a Carter School alum. I earned my PhD here in 2016. And am adjunct faculty, and I teach and I concentrate on the insight approach to conflict analysis and resolution. I also teach at Royal Roads University in British Columbia, and I direct the Center for Applied Insight Conflict Resolution here in DC. So what I'm doing with the lab currently is working on the Activating Curiosity project with Shannon Sneary Alabanza, who's here with us today. She's a master's student. Tamaki Laycock is also on our team. We have an extraordinary team. She's a master's student. And then Belle Jaloshi is a PhD student. So the four of us are really working to understand how activating curiosity in conflict situations can be an effective intervention. And so I'll talk a little bit about what activating curiosity means, but really our goal is to measure the change that happens in conflict when we begin to get curious. And so this is rooted in work that's been done on the insight approach, which is a relatively new set of ideas in conflict resolution, spearheaded by Cheryl Picard and Kenneth Melchin, who are Canadian conflict practitioners and scholars. So about 2008, they came up with this idea of the insight approach, and there's all sorts of literature there. Jamie Price works on it, Marnie Jull. So there's a team of people kind of cross-border who works, including myself, who work on the insight approach. And really what the insight approach suggests is that, conflict is a matter of decision-making, right? So conflicts are the result of people making decisions to act in ways that create friction, that create challenge, that explode into aggression and what we think of as a conflict interaction or conflict dynamic, from micro conflicts within oneself to between individuals to larger scale social conflicts. And when we can break it apart into decisions, like decision making, we can link it to what are we doing with our minds when we're engaging in conflict? What is that thought process? And so what we drawing on another scholar, Bernard Lonergan's work, we've identified that conflict behavior, those things we do that animate conflict, is a function of a decision to defend in response to a feeling of threat. And what we know about threat is that threat compromises our thinking, right? It leads to adrenaline and cortisol. We become certain, we become righteous. We don't think terribly critically about what we think we know, about our assumptions about others. We tend to react in ways that often lead to entrenched cycles of conflict, and also in ways that lead to negative outcomes, things that we're not particularly happy with. So, so what do we do about it, right? That's really the pressing question. We all experience conflict. How can we get ahead of it? And so what the insight approach suggests is that when we activate curiosity, when we get curious about what's the threat and why that defense, when we're looking at those decisions made in conflict, looking at conflict behavior, then we can actually engage critical thinking in a way that opens possibilities for new ways of interacting, new ways of responding, new ways of knowing, new ways of valuing, so that, you know, alternative opportunities can present themselves. So our main mode of intervention is curiosity and discovery. And so in our Activating Curiosity project, what we're doing is, for the first time ever, we're attempting to measure the change that happens when we activate curiosity. So, so what we're doing to do that is we're planning on recruiting volunteers from the community, from either students, adults, basically students, people in the community, who are engaged in active conflict, who have a conflict with in their family or at work or with another student, or it doesn't really matter what the conflict is about, but they're experiencing conflict currently that is getting in the way of their lives functioning well, right? They're mad, they're angry, they're retaliating, whatever it might be. And so what we want to do is we're recruiting these volunteers, and we want to have a conversation with them. We want to first administer a pre-test where we can capture kind of that cognitive, that mental performance. Like I mentioned earlier, when we're gripped by threat, we're not using our minds very well, right? We're assuming, we're judgmental, we are, you know, quick to react. So we want to be able to so we're creating a tool that captures that cognitive or that mental performance. And hopefully, well, we'll see what we'll see what the research reveals, but we want to be able to measure that performance range. And then so that will be our pre-test. And then we're going to have interviews, essentially insight conversations with these individuals that are designed to activate curiosity around threat and defense. So turning their own curiosity in on, okay, so what is the threat? What am I threatened by? Why? What's the impact I'm imagining, right? Asking these questions that often we don't ask ourselves in conflict because we are so focused on defending. So we're going to begin to ask those questions and kind of get the wheels turning there. And again, also, so what's the threat and why that defense? How is whatever your reaction has been within this conflict cycle, how is that, what are you hoping to achieve by doing that? How is that helping you? And so we're going to have that interview, that insight conversation. And then we're going to have a post test that captures performance again. So how has targeting our curiosity towards that thought process around threat and defense, does it, and how does it impact change? Does it change anybody's thinking? Does it open possibilities? That's what we're looking for. Does it kind of expand our the way we are interpreting and discerning significance and our options for going forward? And so that's what we hope to begin to measure. And that's really phase one of our project, because the insight approach has been used as an intervention across the board in mediation originally, in collaborative law. In the work I do, I work with police officers and compliance officers, including in schools. You know, so, and it's been used in leadership, it's been used in a number of places. So what we want to then do is go on to a second phase, depending on what we found in phase 1, and, you know, correlate our discoveries around the impact of curiosity and the to current intervention. So can we further explain what's going on in the interventions that we're working with based on the data and you know, discoveries that we accrue during phase 1. So we're still in early days where we haven't launched phase 1 with the volunteers, but, you know, we're working on our ethics application, and we have our plans are coming together. So we're really excited about moving forward. We think this is hard because it hasn't been done before, but we are hopeful, and we're excited about what we might learn. So that's it. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much. Very exciting project. I've heard your summary before. Every time I hear it is just so fantastic and promising. We have time for questions and comments from anybody. So please raise your hand, the reaction in the reaction tab at the bottom. Raise your hand, or if you put something in the chat now, we can address that. While we're waiting, I just have a question or an observation. First of all, the idea of curiosity is so promising, in part because it's not like it's both radical and achievable. In the sense, it's radical because whoever thought of, well, I guess some people have, but you're talking about curiosity, encouraging curiosity about the other and themselves at the same time, deeply reflecting on their perception of threats, as you said. And that is so achievable in theory. Of course, the details of working out with your experiment obviously are challenging, as you point out, but quite powerful, and potentially can expand beyond the scope of your pilot study. Right?
Yeah, yep, sorry, go ahead, Toni.
No, please react.
No, I think you're right. I mean, we can all, curiosity is human, and we all know how to ask questions. But when we can aim our discovery at certain things, you know, what's going on in ourselves that's leading us to respond in particular ways? What are we worried about? What are we hoping to achieve? What are the systems and structures that are patterning, you know, how we know, how we feel, what we do? I think, you know, starting to penetrate that stuff it's definitely within the capacity of everyone. It's not like you have to be a PhD or a high scholar or even an expert to be able to do it. It's something that once we understand what we're going for, what we're, you know, kind of the world that we're trying to discover, we don't know the answer yet, but then it's very simple to begin asking those questions and reflecting on that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Toni, did you?
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by Dr. Price's research. So I have 2 questions. Well, 1 comment and a question. I'm so excited to see your measurement tool. I think there's so much potential for, I know it's a very difficult task, and so I'm excited to see what you come up with. I'm sure it'll be very useful. The second one is, I'm familiar with your some of your published research in cultivating curiosity, and so I'm curious about what kind of methods or questions are in the discussion that you kind of are using, and if that's too specific for this venue, you know, we can always talk another time too.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just answer or address the first point. The measurement tool has been very interesting and very challenging, because usually measurement tools are surveys that ask questions, right? But we want to be sure not to ask too many questions if we're trying to capture where somebody is right now in their thinking, in their certainty, in their cognitive performance. So we're working on statements. So do you kind of agree with this statement? And that's really our tool. So that's kind of interesting. And then in terms of, questions that activate curiosity, I think that might be a longer conversation, but they really gear towards, what do you think is going to happen, right? What's the future state? Because often our threat is anticipating the future. And so what is somebody imagining the result of somebody else's behavior, or, so we really focus there. And then how is the behavior now going to change or affect that, right? So that's what gets us to start testing what we're feeling and what we're doing.
All right. I saw a hand up a moment ago from Carol Schweiger.
Yes, I was interested to see, we utilize the curiosity kind of component when talking about bias within ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking with somebody who's different, using that curiosity to ask questions that lead to more insight into somebody else's differences so that we understand more. Is that being considered as part of this conversation when you talk about conflict? Is it because of bias? Is it because of differences that are appearing within ourselves and that you're seeing with others?
Well, I think using curiosity to address bias that's what we need to do, right? Where is our
Absolutely.
own bias coming from? What do we think? Why do we think that? And then becoming curious about others too, to really check, who are you? Because you're so much more than my impression, or my stereotypes or whatever. But so in our project now, I think it's more general, right? We're not trying to pinpoint where conflicts are coming from, where do they originate. What we want to do is really measure change. So I imagine that many conflicts are motivated by bias. And I think that would come out in these interviews where people would say, I wonder if what I think about the other person is actually so. So absolutely. But I think we'll also find other active conflicts that aren't necessarily rooted in bias, where that might not be a significant factor. So I think, yes, can be present, but in our project, it's not what we're looking to identify.
It's not driving it necessarily.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Right.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Such an exciting project. And I just want to suggest to everybody else who's listening, stay tuned for some fantastic results from this team. All right. Thank you so much, Megan. Yes, Toni?
There are a couple of, there's a question and a comment in the chat for
Okay.
Dr. Price.
So yes, we will be sharing recruitment information, absolutely. And I think that, appreciative inquiry is something that we will be looking into in terms of how does the insight approach connect to that. So thank you for both of those questions.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much. Wonderful. We're going to move to the second in our sequence project, research project and team, which is led by Nicholas Sherwood. So Nick, tell everyone who you are.
I am Nicholas Sherwood. I am calling in from Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA. International Studies Association was here last week, and I'm hanging around a little bit just kind of enjoying the sights. So who am I in a context of the Carter School? I'm a Ph.D. candidate, and I'm also the Associate Director of the Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation. My work broadly focuses on mental health and well-being within Peacebuilders, peacebuilding practitioners, and also within marginalized communities. I'm going to share some slides with y'all really fast. Okie doke. So here we go. So the core objectives of the team that I'm directing, looking at mental and physical health within peacebuilding practitioners, explain how peacebuilding shapes practice shapes health and vice versa. There's anecdotal evidence from practitioners. Hey, I'm super stressed out by being in the field. Hey, I'm feeling really depleted. And then there's other anecdotal evidence that practitioners are like, well, I love this level of stress. I actually can't imagine doing anything else with my life. And so what is that relationship? What does that relation look like? How to other goals, translating the experiences of peacebuilding practitioners into scholarship, bring the scholarship to meet the practice, which I think is very much in line with the theme of this this semester's Peace Week, theory in action or playing in action. Then testing health building interventions for peacebuilding practitioners across social, political, cultural, psychological contexts. And this last bullet point, this is my personal vision statement with all of my research and work, to create a peacebuilding field that is happier, healthier, safer, and more sustainable for all practitioners. So I'm going to talk to you, really focus on one study in particular that we're running, and then a secondary study that's coming out of it. Also, there is a mama and a papa bird that is building a nest right outside my friend's windows. So y'all might hear little chirps and stuff. Just kind of go with it. It's springtime here in Tennessee. Okay, so what is this study? Mary Hoke Center for Reconciliation, which is again, where I serve as the Associate Director. A lot of the work that we do, almost all the work that we do, is to support insider peacebuilders. Ware and Letterock came up with the term insider partial in the early 90s. MHCR and also this research lab is really keenly interested in the impact of peacebuilding work on the psychological, physical health functioning of insider peacebuilders. So for this study, what we've been doing is recruiting insider peacebuilders, kind of pulled into our network. So we're starting with snowball sampling technique, and then we're gonna move out from there. Sitting down with these peacebuilders and asking them questions related to these. How to insider reconcilers. So again, folks who are doing reconciliation from the outside. These are not external mediators, not external negotiators. These are folks who are working within our communities. How do you understand and define reconciliation and peacebuilding? What are your experiences? What's been your history in the field of peacebuilding practice? And then finally, and this is what's most closely related to Dr. Rothbart's lab, is what's the relation again between peacebuilding practice and health and well-being. So a little bit about our methods. Folks are 18 or older, English speakers. This piece is super important. Native, Indigenous, or originally from a conflict context. For example, one of our participants is a Somali mental health worker who, yes, she came to the US, got her licensed professional counseling degree, sat for her certification, did her observation hours, but she then made the decision to go back to Somalia to bring her mental health expertise to go work in these local Somali communities. So these, what we've seen in a lot of our participants, many of them are from within a conflict context, leave for some period of time, typically to gain an education and experience, exposure to whatever, some other cultural, political context, and then they come back home, bring these new experiences with them, and then they're operating as community transformers, community peace builders. This study in particular focuses on reconciliation, so we're not looking at mediation, arbitration, these other types of, or I guess typologies of what a peacebuilding practitioners look like. eventually I'd like to open up the study to compare to reconcilers. Does the psychological experiences of reconcilers feel differently than arbitrators, feel differently than et cetera? We're not quite there yet. So phase one, our pilot phase is already, we've already finished, which is amazing. Jenna Kitchen, who is a current master's student at the Carter School, interviewed, transcribed, and started data analysis with 10 participants. Belle Jaloshi, who is also on our research team, has really spearheaded analysis with these 10 participants as well. We're now moving into the summer, getting ready for phase two of the study. And so expanding a little bit beyond our networks. At the end of each interview, we ask participants, hey, do you know someone who might be interested in participating in this? What are we actually doing? One semi-structured in-depth interview, focuses again on reconciliation, experiences in the field, and then relation to peace building practice and well-being. Here are some sample interview questions. How might bring people together after violence has occurred, change well-being in a society? These are older questions. We were first advised not to ever use the term reconciliation and kind of allow participants to come up with the term more organically. We've tailored the survey based off participant feedback. They said, hey, like, we all know you're talking about reconciliation. We need to get around the bush here. So simplified a lot of these questions. How might people find healing when coming together, when being reconciled? What are your biggest sources of inspiration or strength? I'm fairly obsessed with the resilience question, which I'm going to get to in just a second. So you're going to see in all of Nick's interviews, all of my qualitative experiments or surveys, I'm always asking a resilience question. So moving into analysis a little bit, tenets of participatory action research really guide pretty much all aspects of the project, from design all the way to dissemination. Interview data is being shared, the transcripts are being shared with every participant. I believe that data is co-owned both by the researcher and by participants. They have every right to have the transcripts as we do. We're checking in with participants throughout the analysis process. Hey, you know, these are some of the big themes or takeaways that our research team come up with. Participant X1Z123, do you agree? Would you change this up a little bit? Did we accurately did we package what you said in an accurate and honest way? We then used grounded theory analysis to really build an original theory of how well-being and peace building shape, magnify, thwart one another. In what context would this, how does this relation play out? From this, we're now moving into a secondary study, which is going to be my dissertation. So again, like I talked about earlier, I'm a man fairly obsessed with resilience. How do we understand it? How do we define it? How do we promote it? How do we build it? And so for my dissertation project, what I'm looking to do is a follow-up and sort of expansion of this original study, not taking the well-being and peace building idea and narrowing it specifically to look at resilience building. So we're using the same roster as participants from the primary study. And the idea here is to do follow-up interviews with participants. Hey, you know, we talked a little bit about some well-being promotion in our original interview. You gave me fairly meaty response, so I'd love to have another conversation, talk about specifically psychological resilience. What kept you up in the lowest times of your peace building practice? Who were the sources of strength in your life? What were the relationships that you derived meaning from? How were you able to stay in this field in the long haul? The goal here, moving from theory to practice, is then to ideally create some sort of resilience building workshops. You know, we'll see if time and funding will allow for this to be actually in the dissertation, but that's definitely a project that I'm going to be engaging in sooner rather than later. So to understand, when we're training peace builders, for example, Carter School Master's Program, how can we get a class on building resilience peace builders into the curriculum, right? Not just at Carter, but when we're thinking about training peace builders in general. I think this is an ongoing conversation we'd be having. So practical applications. A big part of these interviews is the opportunity to debrief. Many of the participants, you know, once we've turned off the recording button and we're done, with the formal interview. Pretty much every interviewee has said, hey, can we actually stay on for a few more minutes? I just want to chat for a second. They'll give us context that for safety and security reasons probably can't make it into the interview. One of the resounding a piece of feedback that I've received and the interviewees or the interviewers I've received is, hey, I've actually not really talked to a lot of people about this. This is the first time that I've been able to really sit and think and engage in conversation. A lot of these folks keep diaries or journals, right? A lot of us, I think, at Carter School and beyond are really identify with this notion of reflective practitioners, and a lot of the practitioners that we speak with definitely would fall into that camp. But for many of them, this is the first time that they're able to speak to a fellow peace builder with a vested interest in mental health. Some of the conversations get really emotional, quite cathartic, and you kind of just need to roll with it. Results from this study, we've already got a few different avenues for dissemination and publication. United States Institute of Peace is asking us to use this work both in high level knowledge sharing, peer support or peer learning sessions that we've got scheduled for this summer. They're also interested in writing this up as part of USIP's internal library. Still negotiations to figure out, is this going to be a small policy paper? Is this going to be a longer production? So stay tuned. Mary Hoekston for Reconciliation is also on a grant sponsored by the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As part of the grant, we're creating an open reconciliation portal. This is going to be a free website for any peacebuilding practitioners, students, scholars, experts. We are taking short bits of testimony from the interviews and we're going to put it on the website. Hi, my name is XYZ. I work in this context, and I practice well-being promotion during the peace building by doing XYZ. So the purpose of the Open Reconciliation Portal is to serve as sort of a resource database, resource compendium, focusing specifically on issues related to reconciliation. But one of our goals with these testimonies is for younger peace builders, folks, maybe high school, undergrad, maybe masters, to hear from these sort of wizened elder peace builders. Hey, this is someone who's been in the work for 40 years. This is how they practice their well-being. Maybe these are tips, tricks, strategies, habits that as you're going into the field, things that you can adopt and keep in the back of your mind. Obviously, dissertation is gonna come out of this. So in conclusion, I believe peace building field, peace and conflict resolution, all of this. I think the field can be completely revolutionized if we are able to better support peace builders. I take a mental health approach. I know there are a bunch of different framings, bunch of different models that we can think about how to better support peace builders. Mental health promotion, sometimes, yeah, it's a one-on-one therapy appointment. Sometimes it's group sessions. One thing I've learned from these interviews is sometimes support is just the knowledge that, hey, I'm actually not alone right now. There are people out there in the world who know about and care about my work, yes, but more importantly, know and care about me. And that's something that this whole team within Dr. Rothbart's lab, this is sort of an ethos that I want to imbue with all of the work that we do, is we're walking alongside people who are doing immensely difficult, often painful, and often joyous work. They're really running the gambit of the full human experience, and that does take a toll. And it's our ethical responsibility to walk alongside them the best that we can. Support, again, takes on many forms: physical and psychological health. Through support, I think we can incentivize more folks to come into the peace building field. My sense, when I started coming into peace building, martyrdom was sort of a word that was always in my mind, like, oh, I'm probably going to be destitute for the rest of my life, and I'm going to be working really, really hard, and altruistic, empathic burnout distress. Yeah, okay. I think that if we can reframe that narrative a little bit and say, no, actually, we have support mechanisms, processes, networks that are here to support peace builders, more folks are going to be incentivized to come into the field. And another really cool deliverable of the project, again, in line with this semester's Peace Week theme, is to bring scholars and practitioners, in the words of Jamie XX, under one roof raving. I'm a huge dance and electronic music fan, so I had to throw in that plug. That is all I have got. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Thank you so much. You want us to be raving? I'm not sure how to rave, but I love the revolutionary framing of this, Nicholas.
Thank you.
This is so exciting, basically, to have your resilience almost training, inseparable from peace building training, obviously. Wonderful. Questions, comments? So I have a question, kind of a follow-up, consistent with what you were saying. What would you like to see in the short run, if anything? Can anything be done? You mentioned a course. Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of something I think is feasible.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have to, coordinate with with our school administrators. What do you think can be done? Can anything be done in the short run? And I'm mindful of our students in this meeting.
Great. So 2 years, year and a half ago, I had the privilege of co-teaching with Mark Gopin. He's a faculty member at the Carter School. We co-taught a class on well-being and peace building. Dr. Gopin gave me a lot of leeway to really build out the syllabus, knowing that the goal was to have, especially master's students who would be going into the field sooner rather than many of the PhDs. He gave me a lot of leeway to build into the syllabus texts on promoting physical, cognitive, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being. I know Dr. Gopin's been able to reteach the class this spring. I think that's a great decision on behalf of the administration. From what I understand, Dr. Gopin and I got really good teaching evals, which to me was a signifier that the course itself is something that students want. Enrollment was high. I think it's also high this semester. So certainly working with Carter School admin and George Mason admin to getting coursework in the curriculum. I mean, if I was the master of Carter, this would be a required course for all masters, PhD, and undergrads, because I think it's unethical to send folks into the field without having a deep dive into keeping them healthy. Outside of coursework, what can we do? Take care of yourselves, grad students. We are putting ourselves through an inordinate amount of stress to get some letters beside our name and some pieces of paper, which are great. And it's not obviously just about that. Get 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night, eat nourishing meals, work out when you can, know your body, understand that. And this took probably until the first year of my PhD. I'll now ask for an extension on a paper. I'm not going to be getting 4 hours of sleep to finish that thing. I won't do it anymore. and that's just kind of a micro lesson here. Take very seriously the fact that your body and mind work in concert. They are both our greatest instruments in the world, period, but also in the peace building field. And so when you wake up, sort of keeping a running catalog of, okay, did I get enough sleep last night? What's something that I'm doing for myself every day? Am I putting nourishing food into my body? Moving out a little bit from there, what are the relationships and social support networks that I have that nourish me, that give me meaning? Another trick that I tell all of our peace builders is everyone's sort of system of resilience and well-being is going to look a little bit different. It's fairly, and there are generalities, yes, but it's an idiosyncratic endeavor at sort of in the final analysis. I want to encourage everyone on the call, maybe not right now, maybe not today, but think about the experiences, aspects, domains in your life that really nourish you. So I'm looking around my sister's apartment. I'm staying with her in Nashville. I see green everywhere. My sister loves to garden. That's something that it's a hobby, it's a passion project. Make a catalog of the things in your life that give you meaning, fulfillment, joy, and that bring you energy. Simply cataloging it, I think, is a really powerful act. And then you can start working on magnifying or adding to that. Unfortunately, Dan, the answer to your question, I sort of put the onus of responsibility on each individual person here on the call, which ignores the broader structural and institutional issues at play that really do thwart well-being. I would argue that higher education is particularly tough on well-being as a general industry. More to come on that, though. I think well-being, health promotion, it starts in the home. Just as peace building, in my opinion, starts in the home. So that's, yeah, I would encourage everyone on the call to start in the micro.
Great. Thank you so much. Naomi?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Nick. I think, though, that you're on point when you indicate the value of having something built into the curriculum. So, and I'll just share, as a person who's coming from a seminary setting, that is the norm. So persons who are going into ministry, and of course, that's a different spirituality orientation, but it is not necessarily dissimilar practice when you are working with people who have experienced trauma, who have been harmed, and working with populations, both individuals and populations. And so most seminaries who have programming for Masters of Divinity students, which is one of my degrees, there is a very intentional spiritual formation curricular alignment of classes and then internships. And it is completely based in exactly what you're saying, which is determining what is life-giving, what maintains health and wholeness for the ministering person, and how to create healthy boundaries between self and other, and self and situation that is being encountered. And there's a lot of psychology, of course, behind that. And so, yeah, I would agree with you. And as a person who has experienced that, I would say that it is extremely valuable and probably a piece that is being overlooked. And while the onus is on the individual, it still is something that has to be taught.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Great.
Thank you so much, Naomi and Nick. It's so exciting to hear about your project. Looking forward to more updates in the future. Wonderful. Moving on to another research team, Toni Farris, and I'm going to ask her to introduce herself. But before I do, I neglected to mention in the beginning, Toni is the manager of the Peace Lab. She is the heart and soul and the expertise at so many different subjects of the Peace Lab. And any success that we have, it all went through Toni and because of Toni. So I'm so grateful for all of your work. So Toni, tell us about your project.
Thank you. That was very kind. Let me share my screen and see if I can talk about this. Can you guys see that? Yeah. Okay. My name's Toni Farris, and I'm here in Virginia/DC. And I'm working on understanding empathy and counter empathy. And right now I'm focusing on policing. For those of you that are not familiar with the concept of counter empathy, we'll talk about it as we go through the presentation. So most people think of empathy as an emotion, But what I'm finding in my research is that it's not. It's more of a functionality. It's a cognitive function, and I think that's what makes this research particularly tie in with the lab. Is we're starting to look at what happens in the mind to create a response of empathy or an empathetic matching of emotions with another person. What the research I'm finding is that it's an attribution process where there are precognitive kind of functionality happening based on identity, and it causes this kind of flow of cognition where there's categorization, boundary definitions, then there's this group identity or individual identity formed. And what that leads to is a precognitive filtering or framing of information that relates in this kind of alignment of emotional response. And then there's the expression, which is identity dependent. So let me take a little step back and talk about kind of an easier language. So because we have what we think of in the field as bias, which I think came up earlier, that bias isn't itself like a standard structural situation. The bias is kind of an easy way to describe something that's happening as a assumption in the person that's creating a cognitive frame. And so as that as the bias is there, or the precognitive assumption or attribution, that's filtering the information that's coming in and influencing the decision making and emotional expression that's coming out. The reason that distinction between bias and precognitive function is really important to me is because that opens the door to some interventions that have to do with neuroplasticity. So if we, in other words, if we can start changing the frame of the underlying attribution, then we can change the way that information is filtered in, and we can change the outcome of the emotion that comes out. So because empathy is considered to be kind of a pro-social emotion in most of our research, it's generally promoted. But because we're looking at this as an identity frame, the pro-social effects are only for the in-group members. So if somebody has an attribution set, or commonly described as bias, towards the in-group, it's possible that that elevates counter-empathetic responses or frames towards the out-group. That's leading us to kind of think about what counter-empathy is. Counter-empathy is an inverse emotional response, and it's generally based on this identity value attribution that's precognitive, and it can be the basis, that's my assumption, for violence towards the out-group. So the way that I like to think about this is in popular movies. In popular movies, there's always the hero, and as the audience, we have a lot of kind of empathy for what's happening with the hero. And as we see him go through his travels, we have more and more empathy with him. And that generates additional counter empathy towards the out group. And by the end of the movie, typically we support the destruction of the villain. And that's almost any movie that you've probably seen, especially an action film. So this feeling of joy at the destruction of the villain is that counter empathy, and it's built by elevating empathy with the hero. It's the big cathartic emotional response. So in a pilot study I was working on with pro-police groups on Facebook, I was examining their empathetic and counter-empathetic expressions towards in-group and out-group members. What I found was that there are way more kinds of empathetic and counter-empathetic expressions of emotional responses than are kind of captured by the basic language that we have. So I was able to make this framework of kind of a continuum of experiences that people were expressing this joy and excitement at the harm of others. And some of them were individual, some of them were group. And one of them that I thought was really interesting is using police as a proxy to harm the outgroup. And those expressions where people were like, I think the police should shoot everyone that's protesting, or I think the police should do X, Y, or Z that was harmful. That got me thinking, you know, how are police being used, at least in these expressions, as a way to bring harm to the outgroup as this counter empathetic response? So I wanted to ask the question, is this model of empathy and counter empathy useful for understanding the conflict between domestic police officers and civilians? And to do that, what I'm working on are 2 case studies working with experienced police officers with intersectional identity. And so what that means is someone who might be a person of color, or someone who is female, or someone who is from an immigrant group, someone that would typically belong to both a policing in-group and someone that might be considered part of the out-group. And I'm looking to have a conversation with them and use thematic analysis to analyze their expressions of in-group and out-group identity as related to policing, and whether there are expressions of empathy or counter empathy towards police themselves or anyone considered to be an out-group in the civilian population. Ultimately, I'm hoping that, you know, by first understanding empathy and counter empathy, if that identity framework applies to police and conflict, then looking forward, if this attributional model is helpful, then we can start looking at the precognition portion of bias to see if we can change that categorization and boundary definitions before the emotional response starts. So this is kind of like taking a step all the way back to see if we can change the way that people are using categorization. And in my kind of my pre-work, my pre-interview with one of the officers, something that really kind of struck me was she was talking about how the identity of policing is formed even in training, and that building of identity as an in-group places everyone else as an out-group. And so I'm curious to see if really that is a peek into some of the counter empathetic responses that might be expressed towards civilians.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Really exciting project, and I am really looking forward to so much more from that. Congratulations so far. You're already getting applause. The floor is open, as they say. Questions, comments?
Carol, did I see your hand up?
No, I was just celebrating it.
Oh, well, that's helpful. Thank you.
So I'd just like to ask Toni kind of about what you said at the end is so important about and throughout your presentation is the prominence, the centrality of both empathy and counter empathy in the identity of police officers. It's somehow embedded in the training, would you say, and their experience? How does that work?
I don't know yet, honestly. This is as far as I know, it's kind of a unique way of looking at peace officers to see. I want to see if that identity component works the same way that we think of identity working in other conflict settings. I'm not sure if that's the case. That's kind of part of my hypothesis, but I don't know if that's really what's going to shake out. So I'm interested to see if this identity function works the same way as we traditionally think of other conflict actors. Some of the hallmarks are certainly there. Earlier, Dr. Price was talking about threat and how threat changes cognition, and that's certainly, part of this model. So I don't know the answer yet. I can't say that for sure, but I think that's what I think it's likely that that's what we will find, that it is useful.
Yeah, there's certainly good reason to kind of establish the connection to conflict dynamics between conflict actors, because it's been widely demonstrated that the identity of in-group kind of purification and out-group demonization, it's so that emotionality is at the forefront of those psychological processes. And of course, your point is that it's in-group empathy to, the heroes and so on, and the victims, and out-group counter empathy. And how do we switch that, or at least expand the empathy from the in-group to a broader range of the other?
Yeah, I think that totally is important to think about, because a lot of the work in conflict resolution, contact theory, or some of the work that we do is about recategorizing people into the new in-group.
Right.
What I'm kind of interested in is if we can decategorize, which I know is a very controversial idea, because our field right now thinks that identity is a basic human need. It's kind of the consensus, but there are some spiritual traditions that talk about more of a oneness idea, where there's a decategorization. So if it works out the way that I think it will, I think that there may be evidence for decategorizing or de-emphasizing that strong salient identity, because while it builds empathy and pro-social behavior within the in-group, I believe that it may also, and there's evidence that supports this, it may build counter-empathy to whatever out-group is formed. And so we may need to look back at the way that we see identity as a basic human need, or as something that we want to elevate, and start to talk about how options of oneness may be more functional for conflict resolution. And then, of course, there may be ethical concerns of safety related to decreasing those kinds of identifications, because I think that there's a relationship between using that pro-social identity to support the in-group can create additional safety, right? And what happens if we do kind of dissolve that in-group? Do we then does it result in less safety for the in-group? Or by decreasing this kind of conflict with the out-group, is the overall net a greater safety?
Right.
I don't know.
Okay. We will be hearing more, I'm sure, exciting reports from you in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So wonderful. So we're going to move on to another project which I'm leading, and Toni, could you facilitate the process and discussion and so on? And I need to share my screen. Okay, so this is a co-researcher project. I'm working with David Michael Stebbins, who is a doctoral student. He's not able to attend today's session. And we are exploring the righteous rage of the January 6th rioters at the US Capitol. The motivation for this is that something I think that anyone who's been attentive to the political conflicts in the United States, they are so riven, they're so deeply committed to exhibiting rage, that the raging comes in so many different forms, and it achieves a kind of symbolic moral force, at least moral from the activists, of self-righteousness based on an image of some claim of injustice that they're struggling with and trying to undermine the injustice of their adversary. And so that we see as pervasive in so many settings in the United States today. It's certainly not limited to the current political conflict. But we are exploring basically the righteous rage in particular. We're doing a case study of the Proud Boys before, during, and after the riot of January 6th. The Proud Boys were actively involved in that riot, in that, if you want to say, insurrection, and their aggression was obvious to the world. It came in many different forms, obviously in terms of the violence, the physical violence. But we also note that their expression of righteous rage follows a long-term pattern of right-wing extremists who are very much familiar with the practices of vigilantism exhibited in terms of their physical violence. The right-wing extremists have a long history in America's rural heartland, that their rage represents almost a defining operating principle of these groups. And of course, they're raging against many perceived enemy groups. The list is quite wide. And I'm referring in particular to what has been designated as 78 hate groups currently operating in the United States. This was from the Southern Poverty Law Council. But I think that we should delve more deeply into the nature of righteous rage. It's much more than a superficial expression of physical violence. That righteous rage is actually a dominant political force, a defining political force of these extremist groups. And what I mean by political force is, first, it's the manifestation of rage, obviously, how rage is exhibited. The symbolic meaning of rage is their moralistic purpose that the activists basically perceive as justifying their rage, their self-righteousness. And there's a mechanism of contagion, a kind of emotional contagion, in which the expression of rage by one or a small group of people can actually spread to other people. We see this routinely in demagogues and dictators who exhibit this behavior of rage, which is then mimicked by their followers. So just about the Proud Boys, the group was formed in 2016 in the immediate aftermath of the election of Donald Trump, and the original leader was Gavin McInnes. This is his picture in the center here of this picture. And the major mission at that time was to promote practices, policies, and mindset of male chauvinism. This was their defining mission on the surface, that it's a male-only group. And one of his statements, like Archie Bunker, we long for the days when girls were girls and men were men. This was a defining aspect of their mission, but they expanded their enemy list, as I'll mention in a minute. We delved into various data sources, Twitter posts, open source group images, encrypted messages from Telegram and WhatsApp. We collected an extensive body of data from their messaging, and we did a thematic analysis of some of their themes, and this is just a small, very small example of our results. So we have here, this is thematic analysis, the verbatim text on the left column, the right column is the sub-theme. So as you can see here, it says there were about 50 men at this gathering and no women because women were not allowed. Western chauvinists refused to apologize. These are obviously quite unapologetic, refused to apologize for creating the modern world. We long for the days when girls were girls, when men were men, being proud of Western culture today. Proud Boys motivated me to be an unapologetic guy I should have been starting in high school. So this was their primary theme. They've had a number of protests, including the relatively large protests in Washington, D.C. in December of 2020. And you can see that their garb is militaristic, that they have various pictures of weapons and so on. Obviously, they were also, many of them were carrying weapons, and they associate obviously with the extreme form of patriotism. Initially, they claimed to be not affiliated with white supremacists, but that claim obviously was clearly undermined because after a couple of years, they basically are trying to broadcast the threats to white power. This is another excerpt of a narrative, and I won't go into detail, but just the second verbatim text, why don't we take back Bethlehem? Why don't we take back Northern Iraq? Why don't we start our own crusades? That's what the Crusades did. They weren't just someone picking on Muslims for no reason. They were a reaction to Muslim tyranny, finally fought back. So this is a combination of a kind of mythical view of the glories of the crusade that they want to promote in modern American society, a kind of militancy against non-Western cultures that they saw, for example, in the war in Iraq. The final statement where we analyzed by the current leader, after Gavin McGinnis, the leader of the group became Enrique Tarrio. He was arrested, and he also basically repeated these claims. He did not participate in the Righteous Rage, in the January 6th personally, because he was in jail at the time. But he basically is promoting this idea that the government, the Biden administration, is basically after those who are speaking the truth, presumably, about the serious threats to America from many of these groups. And the list of groups has really increased quite alarmingly. Obviously, it includes the Democratic Party, it includes liberals, feminists, Black Lives Matter activists. The list is really quite long, which does, of course, intersect with the list of enemies that are recognized by other extremist groups currently operating in the United States. So I'm just going to summarize some of our results so far. That righteous rage among this group, and we think among other right-wing extremist groups, it's not a momentary emotion or expression. It's certainly not superficial. It really constitutes a social political force that defines who they are. That should be they are, who they are, and how they confront their enemy. It's a defining principle. It's an operating mechanism to repeat. And of course, the expression of rage can change from one context to another, from one issue to another. The Proud Boys were very active in the anti-vaccination campaign. They're very active in the campaign against the restrictions for safeguarding against the pandemic. A third point is that they identify themselves as kind of as militants. It's the clothing, they wear helmets, they carry weapons. They take on the persona of the nation's warriors fighting for a just cause. And this really goes to the core of the kind of, it's a psychic power that draws a number of recruits, a number of followers to their cause. And of course, with that kind of psychic power of being the nation's warriors, they constantly need to identify enemies, and they need to basically go from one enemy to another. And they're obviously expressing this rage in various forms in multiple venues. As of now, the group has experienced kind of division. Some of them are distrustful now of Donald Trump. Some members of the group are going to other groups. So it's not clear that they're increasing in their membership, but I think that this is emblematic. Their righteous rage is emblematic of a very disturbing pattern among right-wing extremist groups in the United States and elsewhere. So this is our findings so far. We would love to expand this project, and we're discussing this now, to consider how to undermine their righteous rage. How could they basically transform their hostility and in ways that reduce their sense of aggression against the other? But we're working on that. We're working on that now. Stay tuned for possible results in the future. So I'll stop here, and happy to entertain questions and advice.
I think that's, of course, that's the first time that I've heard that whole presentation. So it's very, very interesting. That population is really, really relevant and striking. I'm sure that we all have curiosity about the details. How did you find, was it hard to get access to that population? What kind of sources were you working with?
Right. Well, we were able to extract the data that I mentioned from those sources, but we did not have interviews. I mean, I would find that really powerful if we were able to, but the challenges are obvious. But we were able to access the open source data that I mentioned, and this was my partner on this project, Dave Stebbings, who was able to get that. It's a lot of information that is available about their chats and their back and forth.
That's awesome. I know it's so difficult to present when we're online, because it's hard to get feedback from the facial expressions and everything of the participants. Is anyone kind of ready to share some thoughts about the presentation or ask some questions about the methodology or
give me advice? Okay, well, that's fine. All right.
Here we go. In the chat, there's a message from Matthew. Can you read it?
Yes, thank you for this presentation and important research. Are you going to explore ways of addressing righteous rage that people try to justify by referring to sacred texts? This is a great question. And obviously, this is, I don't know, and this is Matthew Berry, a doctoral student who asked this question. This question is so appropriate and has been examined to some degree among religious extremers who exhibit righteous rage, and all of the major, certainly the Abrahamic faiths, the religious faith traditions among the Abrahamic faith communities, they have certain members and followers who exhibit righteous rage in this way. Related to the Proud Boys, they take the Constitution as a religious text. They, as it were, make it sacred. And if we had a religious scholar looking at the manifestations of what is sacred to a religious group, if you applied those techniques to the Proud Boys, they say, I'm sure the religious scholar would say, absolutely, they take the Constitution as this sacred text. Some members of the Proud Boys even have tattoos of phrases from the Constitution on their arm. And this comes with all of the familiar psychological compulsion to validate and to glorify the sacred texts that we're familiar with in religious traditions among some communities. So the Constitution is sacred to them. And, it raises the question about what do they know about the interpretation of the Constitution? There's no such thing as a self-evident text of anything, that it always involves interpretation. And I see more in the chat here. For example, some right-wing Christian identity groups in the US justify their violent actions by referring to biblical passages that they interpret in a way that justifies their superiority of one race. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Very good point. So, right, the certain passages could be validated, could be invoked and distorted in a way to validate supremacy, racial supremacy, and so on. So the Proud Boys are using the Constitution to validate male supremacy, basically. Okay. So,
Carol?
Yes, I'm curious to make sure that, it sounds as though sometimes we place Proud Boys in a category of a particular race, but we have seen a variety of participants who don't share the same race. And I just want to make sure that we're conscious of that, because it starts to play into how people categorize a race. Do you disagree with that?
So I'm not sure I follow. Are you saying that the Proud Boys are not all white, or?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sure, absolutely. There's evidence that some Proud Boys are not white, and and as I mentioned, when the Proud Boys were formed in 2016, they claimed that they were not a white supremacist group, but there have been so many statements that promote white supremacy since then. The white supremacy and they don't have to claim to be, they don't have to use the term white supremacy to promote those kind of denigrating, ideology. And this was evident in their promotion of Western societies, the kind of promotion of the Crusades, and the modern day military reckless military interventions by Western powers in Iraq during the Iraq War too. They glorified that. So absolutely, your point is very well taken. So I can't explain why some members of the Proud Boys are not white, but it is factually true.
Mhm.
Okay.
It would be interesting for me to understand a little bit more of how different cultures are associating as Proud Boys, given some of the information that you shared.
Right, right, right. That would be valuable. That would be valuable to see what sectors of society. Again, there's strong evidence that they come from the rural, quote, the rural heartland. That is non-urban, most of them. And of course, we don't have we haven't done a person by person study of each person, but there's a strong tradition that they come from the rural areas. So, okay, so we're gonna finish that presentation. Thank you for your comments. And what do you think, Toni? Any suggestions?
Would you like, we have a couple options. One would be to wrap up a little early, but I would also like to hear about your Sudan project. I don't think we've talked about that yet.
Right, we didn't talk about that. And the reason I didn't want to talk about it here is I'm presenting that with my partners on the Sudan project who involve other people outside the lab. I'm presenting Thursday at 9 o'clock in Peace Week. So obviously everyone's invited to attend that. And we have, so this is, sorry for the plug, but Toni, I didn't ask Toni to do a plug on that.
Shameless.
But yeah, I didn't ask you. But basically, we have at that event experts, just very briefly, this is an oral history project of Sudanese civilians who experienced the ravages of war, who witnessed or experienced directly ravages of war, as well as conveying their vision for a positive future for Sudan, their visions of justice. So that will be presented Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern time. So
please everybody join there. If are there, if there's any lingering questions, we can stay around for a little bit.
Okay.
And if not, then there'd be a 15-minute grace period for everybody to get coffee before they have their next noontime call.
All right, so let's, I think the speakers can stay on. And if there's any individual questions, but I just want to thank everyone for attending today and appreciate so much the discussion.